Okay, let me introduce our panelists here. And first of all, thank you for taking the time to do this. And we always look forward to hearing your comments. I think what we'll do is have each of the panelists give a statement, talk a little bit about some of their impressions of the film, allow some time for them to respond to each other, and then we'll open it up for everybody. Okay? First, our far left, my far left and far right, is Charlotte Dunham, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology.
Associate.
I'm sorry. This is old information that just got pulled off the web. That is a huge distinction to make. Associate Professor of Sociology. You might get with Robin and find out where this came from and make sure they update it, okay?
Come off the web.
Her areas of specialization include sociology of aging and the life course, family sociology, gender and social psychology, and you may want to add to this, but what I've got here for your current research interests include life course in the family, long-term effects of political activism on intergenerational relations and life course timing, predictors of political activism, life course, and predictors of sexual behavior, grandparents and their relationship with grandchildren, employed women who are caring for family members with dementia. Welcome. In the middle, we have Dr. Margene Purington, who is Associate Dean in the Honors College and also Professor in the Department of English. She's in her 13th year at Texas Tech, has written numerous articles on late 18th and early 19th century drama, women writers, feminist theory, pedagogical matters. Member of the Teaching Academy and a recipient of a President's Excellence in Teaching Award, Dr. Purington teaches courses in English, Women's Studies, Comparative Literature, and Honors. She is the teaching section editor for the online project British Women Playwrights around 1800. And closest to me here, Dr. Saad Abi Hamad is Assistant Professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern History in the Department of History. Did I get that right? That's okay. Good. His current interest is in the Egyptian-based nationalists and Islamic reformers of the late 19th and early 20th century and their interactions with officials of the British Empire. His dissertation project, Dueling Perceptions, British and Egyptian Interactions, 1882 to 1919, deals with issues of perceptions and, just as importantly, misperceptions that lead to conflict. Dr. Abi Ahmad was a born fellow to Egypt in 2005, where he spent a considerable part of the year carrying out research for his dissertation. He was also a Churchill Scholar from the University of Texas British Studies Society, from whom he received a fellowship to conduct research in the British Public Records Office. Saad received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, up in Orange, in May of 2007. So let's welcome our panelists.
I think you should begin as the resident expert.
Well, fair enough. I don't know if I call myself a resident expert, but what I would like to do is give you actually a little bit of the background, which the movie is based on, and some of the issues that are actually going on right now. There is no doubt that there is a culture of harassment that is endemic to Egypt. I will be honest. Recent polls have indicated that as many as 83% of Egyptian men have admitted some form of harassment. Now, the vast bulk of this is verbal harassment, but do not in any way underestimate the effect of constant verbal harassment. It is exhausting. You see it. You see it with female colleagues who were with you when you were there. You see it with anyone who, by the way, anyone who's slightly different, but especially young females, are subject to it constantly, and it is exhausting. It is, I would say, actually more than just exhausting. It's criminal to some extent because it creates, the movie stressed by, I'm not much of a movie critic, but stressed the sort of the tension that is felt. Mm-hmm. You should see, after being subjected to this, how these young women will appear. They are literally, I don't know how to describe it, but almost as if they're physically assaulted, even when it's only verbal. So it is constant. Recently, the movie is set in the Mubarak region, so 2010, before the Arab Spring and the fall of the Mubarak regime. Mm-hmm. And for a while, it seemed as if things had gotten better. Recently, however, things have gotten worse. There have been incidents, any of you who follow, there have been incidents of actual, there have been increased incidents of harassment, also increased incidents of assault, and there have been several high-profile physical assaults, including gang rapes. It's odd, we don't know what the factors there. It seems that the instigators might have a political motivation. They are targeting specific women who are around demonstrators. But what's been very depressing to some extent is the variegated response that you're getting from the Egyptian government at the moment. The Egyptian government, even the current Egyptian government, has acknowledged that this is a problem. And the Minister of Justice has come up and said this is a big problem, and that they want to address something. But the Egyptian government at the moment seems to be completely paralyzed as far as doing anything about this. Combine that with this pre-existing culture of shame they talked about here, where the victim, in essence, is victimized twice, is victimized by this culture of shame, and the lack of response, the attack itself, and the victimization by this culture of shame. And you have, honestly, what I would regard as a very serious problem. Now, that is not to say that I don't want you to come out with this impression that Egyptian women are powerless. They're not. They are fighting back, and they're fighting back as hard as they can, and they've rallied support in various parts of society. And this is an ongoing struggle for them. Several movements have emerged, especially around the demonstrators in Tahrir Square, the central part of Egypt where the Arab Spring emerged. Two movements, one is known as Tarjil, which literally translates as man up. Any of you familiar with these, what are these, they used to call them, Paul, did you mention them yesterday, the Avenging Angels from the 1970s? The Guardian Angels from the 1970s, the vigilantes. It's a movement very similar to this movement that emerged in the US in the 1970s, which was basically a form of vigilantism where you have young people out attempt basically to try to provide some sort of protection. And so Tarjid does much the same. And what they're doing, I'm not advocating vigilantism. It doesn't really solve the problem. But what they're doing is they're going after individuals who are constant harassers, and they're spray painting them. They'll write harasser on them in spray paint. However, this has led to physical confrontations, and which has sent people to hospital and so on and so forth. Although I think there is something that this natural response to do something to protect both to protect people that are dear to you is very natural. It's not going to solve anything. There are other movements. One called Red Line, which is also is actually pressuring. It's Khat al-Ahmar. It's trying to pressure the government to legislate, and that's been the biggest issue, the struggle they're having. Let the government legislate. Let the government push the police to do something. The problem is the police themselves. The culture of harassment and this culture of permissibility, this permissibility culture, is endemic to Egypt. So it's endemic to the police force itself, which is either ill-trained or at worst complicit in some of these issues. So, doing something about pushing the Egyptian police to do something about this. They do. Sometimes they'll go out and they'll have campaigns and they'll arrest people. If you remember the last scene where it showed, this is actually based on a real case. There was a case of harassment which ended up with a 3-year jail sentence. But the government seems to blow hot and cold about this. It's as if the government wants to stick its head in the sand and say, this is not a problem we have. This doesn't happen in Egyptian society. Well, it bloody well does, excuse the language. Okay? To address this is something that is something they must do. And this is a great test for the current Egyptian government. This is an Islamist government. The Arab Spring came. They had free elections. They elected an Islamist government. This is a chance for the Islamist government to stand up and say, this is what we stand for. We do not stand for X, Y, Z. What we stand for is justice. And this is a term the Islamists have used constantly, justice. Well, now is their chance to deliver that justice. And I think you get that from the theme, the constant theme of the movie, that what they want is justice. That this is not acceptable behavior, that no one should be subject to this kind of behavior, and what they want is justice. And I think I'll wrap it up there, and I'll be happy to address any other questions you might have about particulars.
I'm reminded that Laura Logan, who is a correspondent on 60 Minutes, was actually a victim of gang rape while she was covering the Egyptian revolution. And so she was a high-profile woman who was subjected to that. One of the things that I found very impressive about the film was its willingness to embrace class differences and generational differences, insofar as you can see how youngsters in the film acquire the ideology that permits them to behave in certain ways toward women, or attitudes toward women, and you know how important it is to break that cycle of repeated behaviors and modeling those behaviors, because you know in many ways the young boys learn that at a young age. And then the difference of class among the women, because obviously some women, by virtue of their financial resources, can extricate themselves from some situations in which physical harassment, at least, might be more prevalent. You know, the film never really used the word feminist, but you know, clearly what these women were doing was taking an activist position in relationship to a human rights violation. And, you know, knowing that the status quo was not responding in ways that were helping women, regardless of their social status, regardless of their age. And I think that was a very powerful sort of statement made by the film. I know that in some countries, in South American countries, for example, where sexual harassment is endemic to the culture, they have found it easier for women to report crimes that violate them sexually when they have women on the police force. And I don't know if that's coming in Egypt or if it's a practice that they have embraced, but women are reluctant to report these crimes. And of course, men who are empowered by that culture's patriarchy are counting on that silence so that the practice is exposed, the practice is not disrupted. Charlotte, you want to add to that?
I guess also, while watching the film, I think that I wanted to kind of create a word of caution that there's a tendency to look at other cultures and look at how, you know, women are oppressed. But honestly, there are a lot of parallels with our own culture to what was going on in that film. Yeah. Women here hesitate to press charges or press a complaint when they've experienced sexual harassment. There's pressure on women here just as there were the women in Egypt. And so I think, and also sexual harassment can be used as a disempowering way to make women feel uncomfortable in public and feel powerless. And even though you say women reacted not in a powerless way, the effect of that kind of practice certainly can make you feel powerless. And it took a lot of courage on the part of those women to step up and take power back for themselves. And it's the same thing happens here. It's there. You know, I was telling Margine, I felt kind of like this was an Egyptian Thelma and Louise, in the sense that it's women who are pushed to the edge by in Thelma and Louise, it's a case of sexual assault. In this case, it's a daily set of harassment that makes it hard to live your life. And you know, the same things that happen in Egypt happen here, happen in Ghana, happen in Turkey, happen in many other parts of the world. So I think it's a global issue for women and men.
And it's maybe hard for us in Lubbock to kind of see those parallels. But if you've ever ridden the subway in New York City at rush hour or Philadelphia, you can get a better sense of what those women were.
I would also add something very quickly. The recent attacks were actually very much about disempowering. Were very much aimed at disempowering and silencing. So there's a political dimension to these attacks. That's why we're very careful in how we deal with this. I'm talking about the most recent violent attack that were the 4 or 5 cases that we know about that were rapes. One of them even involved how graphic can I get?
Yeah.
One of them even involved the use of a knife. Beg your pardon, and it's you know, if you read any of the literature on rape, it's not about sex. It's about it's about power. It's about intimidation. It's about the crassest elements of human nature in some essences, and that's what we're seeing there. And but it's the culture of permissibility that really worries me about it the most. So it's definitely, they are trying to disempower them. However, and you know, this is the thing that's so admirable, is how strong their response has been. Even some of these attacks were attempts to keep them from the demonstrations, and yet they're still showing up at the demonstrations. And basically, they're having to take precautions. And the one theme, if you notice at the end of the movie, when one of the characters tells the others, well, it's your loose hair, it's your loose dress, any excuse in a storm, any excuse in a port, so to, in a storm, so to speak. And recently, after one of these attacks, members in the government, not of the main body Islamist government, but of the radical right, members of the government, basically one of them said, well, if they associate with thugs down at the demonstrations, this is what they're going to get, this is what they deserve, they bring it on themselves. Another one claimed that, he said, well, those tents are tents of prostitution, the protesters' tents are tents of prostitution anyway. Now, they might be just two voices out of hundreds. The problem is, and I want to be very careful about this analogy. If you remember the Gifford case, the Gifford shooting, after the Gifford shooting, there was this discussion of, because we're demonizing each other, that even if the guy is mad, the gentleman who did the shooting, the Gifford shooting, is not mentally stable. That it's the culture of permissibility where we're dehumanizing each other that is leading to this. How else can we see these comments by these supposedly government officials who are saying, well, they got what they deserved, or these attempts of prostitution, other than a way to dehumanize, which allows people who are on the fringe or radicals to say, oh, this is permissible. And then add to that the culture of permissibility, and that's where there's a problem. Again, I think the word of caution is well taken. Yeah. We do have to be careful. When we talk, feminism is closely associated with imperialism in Middle East and the rest of the world. So most of the females who work in these fields prefer to be termed gender activists. There are also Islamic gender activists who use use Islamic models to attack this kind of behavior, and some of them have been quite successful. Some of them have not. So we have to be careful about projecting our own needs. So we have to be careful about that. But again, these are also human rights issues.
Yeah.
There can be no doubt about it. These are human rights issues. I have to admit, this is something that has for a while has had me riled up. But the best approach I can think of, if I were to engage in activism, which I'm a bit of a sloth, but I'm verging on it, is actually to contact these organizations and find out what we can do to help, rather than project what we think we can help. Finding out more about this, finding out what we can do, if anyone's so inclined, is, I think, a great way forward.
I think one really important point in the film was that this disempowers men too, and it is harmful for men's relationships. So I think your point about, being active is especially true for men, to take that step to make it not okay for other men to behave in that way.
There was also, if you notice, multiple themes in the movie. One of them is the theme of economic dispossession. If you notice the economic powerlessness that a lot of these, if you notice a lot of the characters that they talked about that were carrying out this behavior, did you notice their employment status? Yeah. Most were unemployed. Most were unemployed, and this is very common among. It's sort of I don't know if it's an attempt. I mean, I don't want to speculate, but some have speculated it's an attempt to seize some amount of power back by intimidating those who are weaker than yourself. A very crass response, but apparently a very human one. So,
yeah, if I could jump in, I thought the economic issue was really interesting, because very early on it's established that there is a form of economic oppression as well as patriarchy.
Yeah.
Because if she had enough money to be able to
take a cab,
then she wouldn't be subjected to this. Although I found the opening shots really interesting in the sense of all those mirrors in the cab.
They could be,
and
yeah.
she was under surveillance, not just by the regular installed stock rearview mirror, but there were all these other mirrors that she was feeling the male gaze.
Absolutely.
You know, to use a term from feminist theory, the male gaze from multiple viewpoints, but it was just, you know, one guy, but using that effect of many mirrors. It was like, you know, almost all men are looking at her. I think that gets played out through it, and then also the responses of the wealthier men also, I think, said something about economic privilege and how far that can take you out of, you know, the situation of, you know, being gendered, but also, you know, being part of this group that is an oppressive force, particularly the role of the doctor, right? I guess maybe that's you know, using a Western value, but I would assume that in Islam and the Middle East, the doctors are also, you know,
yeah, they
held
are
up as figures of status. Well, he wasn't really any better off than you know, the poorer husband in terms of being able to, you know, deal with his relationship with women. Let me just say a couple of other things from a media perspective, and then I'll hand it back to the panelists, and then out to y'all. I don't know if others agree, but I felt like maybe the story was a little too contrived in places, like trying to pull these threads together with her stepping off the bus, and I'm not sure that really moved the narrative forward. That's kind of a narrative structure that we've been seeing in film for the last 10 years, but I'm not sure that it was necessary. And even when, you know, it was the husband who got stabbed at the very end, you're kind of wondering, you know, is that important? And how likely is that in, you know, the city of however many million?
18 million in Cairo and Sandbox.
Wow.
I'm sorry?
About 18 million in Cairo and
18
Sandbox.
million? Yeah. That's huge. And I thought there was a really interesting moment also with the detective when his wife died. I mean, it was a very moving scene in a lot of ways, but I was questioning how much of his loss is for her, you know, in his relationship with her, and, you know, not having his partner anymore, versus the heavy burden setting in immediately of being responsible for those kids, and particularly a young baby. And so I think we're questioning those tears that are, you know, flowing out from underneath his glasses. Like, where are they coming from? How much of it is the loss of you know, the object of his love versus the caretaker for his children and the one who will run his household. So I thought that was a very interesting moment. And for me, anyway, even as somebody who, you know, specializes in international communication and should probably know better, it's really hard for me to read this film without looking at it through the lens of the Arab Spring.
And you know,
as a pre, you know, Arab Spring film, it's really hard not to look at it and sort of assess the social processes that are going on there, with not through the lens of the political upheaval.
You can't, because it is very much, I mean, the individuals involved in this movie, the comedians, for example, when they speak, I don't know if you noticed the last scene where he's talking about who are the Egyptians. It's you and I. Don't throw up your hands and say you can't. They used to say, we used to joke that a lot of times when we were in Egypt, that it was the three words that Egyptians were most delighted with were inshallah, God willing, ma'alesh, basically let it go, and mashi, it's okay. So nothing, the sense of powerlessness, an absolute sense of powerlessness. And he presages that by saying, no, you know, it's you and I, let's have a conversation. We are the Egyptians. Let's have this conversation. I think presage the Arab Spring in that respect. And that's very much of what the Arab Spring was about initially. It was about having a voice.
So are you suggesting the notion of sort of fatalism? Like
there used to be.
We're not in control anyway.
And I don't want to be an Orientalist, and I'm not minister to the imagination, but there seems to have been a sense of fatalism for about 10 to 20 years that pervaded Egyptian society. You know, cut cycles, happen cycles. This is broken. This is definitely broken. And I think in the long term, this is going to be for the good of Egyptian society. In the short term, we're going to see a chaos. And in every situation, I was looking at some figures, by the way, every time you have a revolution, incidents of violence, all kinds of violence, including violence against women, peak. So we are seeing these fluctuations right now in Egyptian society, but for better or for worse, I would argue that Egyptian society has changed. The newer generation has abandoned the sense of fatalism. Just to give you a funny example, I would call a restaurant. I would ask them. I called a restaurant or make a delivery and asked them, "Is this so-and-so restaurant, Fulfilla?" And he said, "God willing." Well, what do you mean, God willing? Don't you know if this is the restaurant or not? Or you'd ask the taxi driver, "Can you drop me at the corner?" And he'd say, "God willing." And you're driving. I know it's just an expression, but it became so common that, so take some responsibility. And that's definitely happened, I would argue. And that cycle is broken. He does hit you over the head with these themes. As you were so well pointing out, he hits you over the head with these themes, and sometimes it does seem heavily contrived. But I'm wondering how much of it is because it is he's trying to make a groundbreaking argument for that particular cinema. And so, but as a non-cinema individual, that was my... Because in our fields, whenever you want to make a brand new argument, you go over the top, in essence. And I was wondering if that could have been part of the dynamic there.
And could you talk a little bit about the potential reception in Egyptian society of a film like this? I mean, I know there were some protests and it brought about some lawsuits and that kind of thing.
Absolutely, and then you'll always have members of parliament that will say that it's insulting Egyptians, very much like the Turkish model. It's insulting Egypt's honor and so on and so forth. I haven't seen any figures, and I tried to do a few searches to see any figures for actual reception, and I couldn't find anything. But I'm actually intrigued enough to continue looking right now. I would really like to see how much of a reception it has in Egypt. It's not the kind of movie that you would, even among the genre of Arabic movie. And issues of assault and things have been dealt with before, but in a different lens. And I don't know what kind of reception this will have.
Anything else for the panelists, or should we open it up?
I have a question for you. Is there a special significance of having a comedy club and a comedian in this movie? I've read that comedy clubs are very popular in Egypt right now, and
it's a good question. I don't. When I was there, they had just started, and they're associated with a very young generation, with generally a secularist generation. And so, although one interesting thing has happened recently is a neurosurgeon basically quit his day job as a neurosurgeon and has become the Jon Stewart of Egypt. He took as his model Jon Stewart, and he actually came and appeared on Jon Stewart, the Jon Stewart Show, and he has a political satire show, which does things that 2 years ago he would not have even imagined. So he mocks the president. His name is Morsi, so he calls him Super Morsi as a joke, and he mocks, he gently mocks him and so on and so forth. This is something completely new, and his is one of the most watched shows, at least among the younger generation in Egypt. So I can't answer more than that.
Okay. Please, comments, questions, observations? The audience?
I don't know, and I saw his tears in that scene as maybe symbolic of the price, the sacrifice for having this kind of attitude and behavior in his society, and perhaps there can be change by the time his daughter is old enough to experience that kind of sexual harassment. The first time he visits, or he has the three women in his office, the wife has not expired from childbirth. So I think his mindset was already more enlightened, or he understood a little bit more, had a greater sense of tolerance for their actions. But I think by the time he had lost his wife and realized, he had a daughter that perhaps, and that's a mechanism that's built into the film. But I think it's a powerful one, and the notion that you have to bring both men and women together on this, working together and re-educating them in order for there to be significant social change. So I saw that scene just, I wasn't really looking for the reality. To me, it was a really poignant, symbolic moment.
And, maybe one way to read the two situations where he lets the women go, the first one seemed more strategic to me, given the situation, and then after he has the daughter, that seemed more compassionate. I mean, they were both thoughtful, but I think you could read his different motivations behind them, and probably that intervening scene.
I had similar. I think
I'm sorry.
I think you're spot on that. It struck me the same way. One was a cynical calculation about, okay, how do I want to deal with this? The other one was very much sort of a realization, more human reaction. But contrived or not, it was a good tool, I think. For,
I think there was also an element of the loss of his wife that, rushing her to the hospital and not making it because he's got to go do something for his boss. And that conversation they had, oh, I know you wanted a daughter. And so I saw it as kind of a poignancy that he realized a lost opportunity with the woman he really loved and cared about. Another way that this kind of oppression affected his life in a deep kind of way. So I saw him as crying for his wife as well as for.
And I'll be honest, I mean, it's a bit of a depressing movie, so any little bit of cheer at the end was well received on my part. But it's a little bit. It was beautiful. I enjoyed it, but it was a little bit.
Please.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Right now, it is under transition in power. So, what do you think about those who now don't have harassment? It's just like a
Do you want me to take it? Okay.
Yeah,
but-
I don't even know
no,
what he
I
said.
can, as far as
we have white noise here.
yeah, as far as what the government's doing with the existing laws.
yes.
Well, this is what part of the problem right now is that there seems to be an incoherence as far as response. So there doesn't seem to be much in the way of enforcement. But the government seems to be reacting in fits and starts. When there's for example, the government's most recent attack on this front is to send out pamphlets to the mosques to urge to tell the mosque leaders to speak up against harassment. But that's not a law. That's not, that is a response, and fine, this is wonderful. Okay, do it. You should, because we need to change the culture. And this is something, if you look at the Egyptian activists who are working on this, they're saying we need to change the culture. Fine. But you also need to train your police, which they're not. And you need to make sure that they carry this out, that they carry out arrests for these things, that reports are filed. And they're not, unfortunately. Right now, they're not. And I think earlier I mentioned that this is would be a great opportunity for them. And unfortunately, I don't know what's going to happen. I also don't know what's happening. By the way, this week, there's a significant symposium at the Woodrow Wilson Foundation in D.C. actually on this issue as well. So it is being kept in the spotlight, hopefully.
Other questions or comments?
I just had a question about when the two women or three women are arguing over their differing viewpoints, and she calls back to a day when people did used to wear revealing clothing. And could you give me a little bit of background on when that was and what stopped it?
Yeah.
In the 50s and in the 50s through the 60s, there was a huge wave of secularization spreading across the entire Middle East, and Egypt was at the forefront of this wave of secularization. So 9 out of 10 women did not wear the hijab. 9 out of 10 women wore basically what was common dress at the time, the mini jupe or whatever the dress of that time period was, and a lot of people argue that today it's the opposite way around. 9 out of 10 women are veiled. And people have argued, this is not accepted by everyone, people have argued that part of it is the failure of the politics of secularization, that did not improve the situation. Economically, people are in some cases worse off than they were before, although this is not really technically true, but the gap of wealth is greater, and that people recognize the failure of secularism, and hence they wanted to try another alternative. And hence they're swinging all the way back to Islamism at the moment. And there are 12 arguments in between. If we had a day, we could go over every single one of them. But there was that shift, and some people indicated it's starting to happen in the late 60s, early 70s, possibly also indicating the failure of the Egyptian state in its wars against Egypt, and that this model of secularization failed, so we need to try something else.
Anything else on that point?
I might add that Egypt was not the only place that this happened too. We tend to think of Afghanistan, for example, as being a place where women, wear burqas, where their entire bodies are covered. In fact, in the 70s, women did not wear veils nearly as much as they do now. Mm-hmm. So it's a region-wide kind of trend. Mm-hmm.
And I would just add very quickly that I think it also reflects this sort of cultural tension between the local and the traditional, and what's coming from the outside and perceived as foreign. And that tension, that clash, if you will, gets played out in very different ways within countries as well as across countries. And I think that's part of it. It wasn't explicitly stated, but I think the underlying message was, you're not really being Egyptian. You're acting very Westernized.
And there's a specific term for that, istighrab. But just to tell you a small anecdote that really represents this, the president of Egypt in the 1950s was a gentleman by the name of Abd al-Nasser. Very popular, populist. And there's this speech you can find on YouTube, actually, and it's hilarious. He's talking to a large political gathering. And he says, I just met with the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the head of the Muslim Brotherhood told me, you as president need to uphold the morality of the country. So you need to make sure that the women wear veils. And Nasser stops, pauses, looks at the crowd and says, he wants me to make 12 million women wear the veil? And then he stops and he says, then and the Nasser says, I asked him, so your daughter is in medical school, right? And the head of the Muslim Brotherhood says, well, yes. And your daughter doesn't wear the veil, does she? Well, no. Well, if you can't get your daughter to wear the veil, I'm going to force 12 million women to wear the veil? Sort of an anecdote to represent sort of the shifting attitudes. But again, this seeming failure of the governments that promised so much in the 50s and 60s. They promised the world, we will give you a better life, we will do all this. And they didn't deliver. And partially, this could be seen as a reaction. There are other factors as well, economic trends coming out of Saudi Arabia, for example. As more and more Egyptians migrated to work in Saudi Arabia because they couldn't find work at home, some have argued that they were influenced by the Saudi brand of religious practice and belief, which bled back when they came back home. For some women, taking the veil is also a way to empower themselves. Interviews throughout, some women say, well, this is a way for us to empower ourselves as well. And the veil comes in all kinds of varieties. There's everything from the burqa, which is the full headed, to what basically is a small, stylish garment that you cover your hair with. So it varies.
But how much would you say that because of this cultural submission is due to Islam itself, since Islam just seems to be very submissive?
Well, I'm not an expert on Islam, but I think it varies depending upon the interpretation of those in charge at the time.
And I would also add that if you look if you look at the period of the Quran, the Quran, the period of the Prophet itself, that early period, of course, any student will tell you that there were some very powerful figures, female figures in Islam. So it depends on which interpretation you take, right? Yeah. I'll give you an example. If you look at, let's say you take Christianity, right? And you accept the Old Testament as part of Christianity. I have the right to sell my daughter, right? I have the right to sacrifice my son Well, if requested, apparently. But so these religious texts represented a particular cultural period and so forth, but all of them have this element of interpretation where you can interpret it in a way to be very empowering to women. Even Islam in itself, you have passages in Islam that repeatedly say, talk about honoring your mother, honoring your daughter, and so forth. And for the time in which it emerged, actually, Islamic practices, especially in Arabia, were delivered a massive amount of rights to women that they might not have had prior to that. Mm-hmm. And up to probably the 6th century, as far as laws of inheritance, maybe even 18th century, laws of inheritance, and I think fellow panelists can speak more about that than I can. Laws of inheritance were much more equitable in Islam to women than they were in Christianity. A woman in Islam could retain property rights, whereas in much of Western Europe, when you married, you lost all your property rights. So it depends how you interpret it. Like any religion, it depends solely on how you interpret it, because even Muslim scholars like to say Islam is one, but you know what? The interpretations are many.
And you can.
Seems to be very much most biblical circles, even like places that haven't stated Sharia law.
Okay, no worries.
But you can see the tension manifested in all three of the domestic relationships portrayed here, where the men are still trying to kind of find their way, their place within the marriages or the fiancé with respect to both culture and religion, I think. And it changed so quickly. For us, we've had a kind of slow evolutionary movement in the West. But the women who have daughters who now wear the veil probably didn't when they were that age. And so it changed very quickly.
And there's a process, I was talking about it in my class today, actually, and there was a process in the West of internalizing religion and personalizing religion. And so as we personalized religion in the West, interpretation became almost individualized. So you could choose what to dismiss from the text, from the holy text that you choose to follow. And a lot of people dismiss, even those who claim to be devout Christians or devout Jews, dismiss a lot of their holy text. You could argue that process is incomplete yet in Islam. You could make the argument. But it's all about interpretation. Which text am I looking at? Which passage am I going to look at? The one that tells me you can, thou shalt not kill, or the one that tells me you can kill all their men and their male children and keep unto yourself those women that have not known men. This is straight out of the Old Testament, right? Which one are you going to choose? And it's the same process that they're undergoing. And the problem they're having also is the external pressures on that region are intense. They don't have the time to do things slowly at their own pace. Whether it was imperialism in the late 19th, early 20th century, or interference for oil, economic interference today, they're always under pressure. They don't have time to digest things slowly.
I was curious what was going to happen to the two women that threatened divorce. I don't know that something
Nellie?
No,
Siba and Nelly are the wealthy one. Faisal.
Faiza said to her husband, "Why did you do this? You could divorce me. You could take a second wife.
Yeah.
You could do this." And then the wealthiest begs her husband to
Divorce her.
So what happens to them?
Traditionally, unless and this depends on which school of law in Islam you follow, and this is another thing maybe I should make clear. There are in Sunni Islam there are 4 schools of law you can follow, 4 interpretations of Sharia, and each one is different as far as the laws of divorce. But traditionally, unless the woman held the marriage contract, she didn't have the right to divorce. In Egypt, that changed about a decade ago. There was a law that was introduced about a decade ago that allowed women to actually file for divorce. So this is a little bit anachronistic, and therefore, drama's sake, she could have filed for divorce in her own right.
Financially, was she her home? It looked like the jewelry business wasn't enough to support. It was almost a nice
Hobby.
Yeah.
But I just want to, and then the poorer woman, she's in the store.
It depends on the marriage contract. The marriage contract spells these things out. So
Each individual couple.
yes.
Okay.
So it's a contract that you negotiate with your family, and the families negotiate. So there's a mahr, there's a dowry, but there's also what's known as an addaba and a mu'akhar, which is monies that are paid in case of divorce. So they might not be enough actually to support her. In a lot of cases, what she'll have to do is return to her family.
Right, and I wondered about her telling the poor woman, telling her husband, you could have divorced
Right.
me, or you could have taken a second wife.
Right.
He can't afford one family.
Let alone
As I
two.
understand it, if he takes a second wife, everything has to be equal. She has to
Technically.
have the same type of apartment,
Technically.
the same amount of money,
Absolutely.
the same
Absolutely.
everything.
And
He can't afford one.
no, absolutely, and tech. I mean, rarely. I think Egypt is one of the countries where you have to actually have the permission of the courts for a second wife. So you have to prove that you can do this. Polygamy in Egypt is not common.
No.
It's not common at all. Yeah, but divorce is. They have the same rate of divorce as we do, especially among young couples. They have almost an identical rate of divorce, but. As you could see, I mean, financially, she's a working woman, and most of the times what will happen is she'll end up returning to her family, and you do the best you can.
Children.
Were the deductions from her paycheck legal and taxes, this or that, or did the guy just decide, oh, I'll take 20?
No, I think what they said is because she was late to work, so her hourlies were being deducted. That's what I understood. I don't know if anyone understood it differently. Yeah, but you have to understand also wages for government employees in these jobs. Yeah, you're talking about $100, maybe $100 a month, $80 a month. The disparity of wealth in Egypt is tremendous, which is shown. I mean,
Yes.
this is the point you were making
Yes.
constantly.
Yeah.
By the way, it showed the woman in the Escalade, right? The Escalade to get to Egypt, if you don't have connections, is a $150,000 car.
Yeah.
But you see a lot of those in Egypt. Why? Because there is a small, very wealthy class. Another thing, more than likely, she would not have driven herself.
She would have had a driver.
She would know, even if she knew how to drive, she'd have a driver because
Yeah.
parking is a nightmare in Cairo. So you have a driver, and it's interesting to see that dynamic as well. Wealthy women with male drivers who come from poorer families treat them like dross. I mean, it's amazing. But he's basically your parking attendant, your driver, your catch-all, and so. There are all these dynamics at play.
Is there another comment? Question? No? I guess we'll end the session then. Let's thank our panelists once again.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.